All right, so this video is a review of Module 4, which were chapters 24 and 25. We talk about price controls. We talk about putting economic science to the test. So firstly, before getting into those price controls, we need to talk about fairness a little bit. So when we're using price controls, our ultimate goal is to keep prices from going too high or too low. It's to keep the fluctuations kind of balanced out within a market. So when we use price controls, there are going to be certain winners and losers. So we need to think about, is our version of unfair everyone not having the same amount of a good? Is unfair not everyone being able to afford a certain good? So if inability to pay is what we consider fair versus not fair, then we cannot come to price controls to kind of solve that problem. Because like I said, with price controls, there will be losers. So if we think about a price control trying to help consumers by lowering the price of something, the producers that have these high costs of production are going to start dropping out. If a price ceiling is put on some kind of market where we're trying to keep the price from going too high, we're trying to protect consumers. In doing that, what's going to happen is those high cost producers are going to start to drop out because they can't keep up with the other firms creating this product, producing this product at this lower price. All right. So because scarcity is everywhere, we have to make these choices that may not always seem fair, okay? So what exactly are price controls? Price controls are any restriction, any law in the movement of free floating prices. So we know from our last few chapters that prices are a signal. Prices signal scarcity. They signal demand in the market. They signal what suppliers are up to, what kind of cost suppliers are facing, what kind of production issues that these suppliers are facing. All of these signals are tied up in what we call a price signal. So when we put these price controls on, we're restricting that movement in these price signals. So there are two examples of price controls. One is a price floor, which makes it illegal to sell below a minimum allotted price, and a price ceiling, which makes it illegal to sell above a minimum price. So let's go on to talk about each of these. So first, we're going to talk about price floor. So like I said, a price floor is a minimum required price, a guaranteed price, minimum price within a market. So one example of a price floor is what the government uses to support farmers, to support dying agriculture. So what happens is the government actually meets that additional price. So they will pay farmers this additional price in order to meet a certain price in a market, a higher price, this price floor in the market. So that's one way, this price support, where the government kind of kicks in a little bit of the market price to farmers in order to keep their prices low. So another easy example of a price floor is the minimum wage. So when we're hiring for labor, a price floor, a minimum wage, sets a legal price minimum where we cannot go below this. So let's go to the graph to look at that minimum wage, okay? So for this first example, we are going to talk about the labor market. So in this case, let's talk about a price floor, the minimum wage. So in the labor market, we know the supply is made up by individuals, households that supply their labor to these companies, these firms. And then the demand is from these companies and firms that demands labor. So at our original equilibrium, we see that we have a price here. And we see that we have a quantity down here. So this is when, these are our equilibrium price and quantities. when there is no restriction in the market. This is where everyone is as happy as they can be. We are maximizing our gains of trade here. So when we set some kind of price floor, so what'll happen is our price floor will move, I'll draw it in green. Our price floor must be set above equilibrium price in order to be effective. So if we want to make some kind of higher minimum wage, let's say this P star, for example, is $6. And I want to make my minimum wage in this graph $8. So at $8 right here, I'm going to set this price control, this new price control at $8. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to find where at $8 I'm going to hit on my demand line, and where at $8 I'm going to hit on my supply line, my supply and demand curves. So now we see that we are in disequilibrium. When we set this price control of $8, when we are setting above the equilibrium price, we are now in disequilibrium. So what this means is we can come down here, and now at our price of $8 at this minimum wage, our quantity of the minimum wage is now a lot lower than our equilibrium quantity would be otherwise in a market where prices are able to be free floating. So let's talk about the supply now. At $8, we have a supply that's a lot larger than the supply we had before. So this is our quantity demanded of the minimum wage, and this is our quantity of the minimum wage for supply. So this is our quantity supplied, and this is our quantity demanded. So we see now that this quantity demand is greater than our quantity supplied. This means that we have in this market, we will have our quantity demand is actually less than our quantity supplied. We have a larger quantity supplied in this market, meaning that when our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity demanded, we have a surplus. We are in a surplus, okay? At this point, we have more people that are willing to work than companies are willing to hire at that price. So at the price of $8, we see that the supply for labor, the people that may not have worked at $6, now because of that increase in minimum wage, we're gaining this many more people to supply in our labor market. So now we have additional people wanting to work at $8, but at that $8, we're actually losing on this side some of our demand. At $8, we're losing these producers on the demand curve. These companies at $8 cannot and do not want to, or maybe cannot afford to hire that many people at $8. So we can see just from this simple example how price controls can start to distort markets. Okay, when we have these free floating prices, we get these signals about scarcity, about what's going on in the market, about input prices. And the genius thing about that is we don't need to know every single fact. We don't need to know all these little factors. We just need to know, is the price moving up or down? We just need to see that signal. So like I said, in this case, when our price control increases the price, we're going to have a surplus of workers. We're going to have too many people, a quantity supplied that is higher than a quantity demanded. So a surplus. All right. So that is a price floor. That's an example of a price floor. So let's go back to our PowerPoint. All right. So we saw in this example of the price floor, in this example of the minimum wage, that price floors are going to lead to a surplus in the minimum wage market, a surplus of workers. So a price ceiling, the example of a price ceiling is going to be now, instead of setting a price where we cannot go below, actually, let's go back to that graph a little bit. Before clearing this, I want to talk a little bit about this $8. So when we set this price floor at $8 right here, we are legally binding this price, so no producer can pay under $8. So when we set this above the equilibrium here, when we want to set a price floor, we need to make sure it's above equilibrium. So now that we're going to clear all these drawings, we want to draw a price ceiling. So instead of a price floor, which needs to be set above equilibrium price, now we're going to talk about this price ceiling, where we need to set it below equilibrium price in order for it to be binding, in order for it to be effective. So firstly, I'm going to show an example of a price ceiling that is set above our equilibrium price. And I'm going to show you in this case that when our price ceiling is above, we do not have a binding price control. This is a non-binding price control. Okay, so I'm going to show a quick example of that right now. So when we set a price ceiling, we are setting a maximum allotted price. So we have our supply curve, we have our demand curve. Okay, so when we set a price ceiling, once again, we want to make sure it's binding. So in this case, I'm going to show setting a price ceiling above our equilibrium price. What's going to happen in that case? So we see these are our equilibrium price and quantity. So when we talk about a price ceiling, we are talking about a maximum allowed price to be charged. So in this case, when we have a price above our equilibrium price and we're setting this price ceiling where no consumer or no producer can charge above this price, this is not binding. We in the market are down here at this equilibrium price and we're happy right here. We're happy. We don't want to charge any more above. Producers will not charge above because then we're going to start to lose consumers in the market. So in this case, when we see a price ceiling set above our equilibrium price, it will not matter. We are still going to be down here at this equilibrium price and this equilibrium quantity because no consumer is going to want to charge up here anyways. A price ceiling is keeping the price below a certain amount. And at this amount, producers don't want to charge up here anyways. We're already charging down here. So legally, we're fine. Producers in the market are fine. But once again, this price ceiling is going to be non-binding when it's set above equilibrium price. So in this case, now we know that for a binding price control, we know a price floor must be set above equilibrium price, and this is a minimum allowed price. For a price ceiling, we know we must set it below equilibrium price. Okay, so once again, in order for a price control to be binding, it must change that market price. So in that last case where we had a price ceiling above equilibrium price, it wasn't binding because everybody was already at, all consumers, all producers were already at our happy equilibrium point we wanted to be at. So now let's draw an example of a price ceiling when it is correctly set. Let's see the repercussions of a price ceiling when it is effectively used. All right, so setting this price ceiling, once again, we want it below equilibrium price. So in a market where we see just any kind of market where equilibrium is right here at P star, Q star, our price ceiling needs to be set below. So this is going to be in red, and my price ceiling is setting that maximum allowed price, and I'm going to set it right here. So I can put numbers in. So let's say this is $10 right here. And let's say our new allotted price is $5. So at our new price control of $5, we have this new price ceiling, right? Set at $5. In this case, now we are looking at a quantity supplied right here. So our quantity supplied has decreased and our quantity demand has increased. Okay, because we know this is our supply curve and this is our demand curve. Sorry for not labeling those. Okay, so now at this point of my $5 price ceiling, when there's some kind of law set for producers saying, hey, we cannot charge over $5, we have all these people coming into the market that say, okay, at $10, I would not purchase this product. But when our price decreases to $5, sure, my willingness to pay is either greater than or equal to $5. Whereas now suppliers, so the firms producing whatever good this market is, they say, if we can only charge $5 per item for market price, one, some of these high cost producers will not be able to keep up with these low cost producers at this market price. Two, producers may not be willing to even sell at that price. They might say, okay, it's not worth our time to keep producing and selling this good if we're only able to make this much of a profit, rather than if we were able to charge that $10. So at $5, producers are losing that profit because this is the maximum allowed price they can charge. So we're losing profit in this case, and if from this price ceiling, okay? So we know that in this case, our quantity supplied is less than our quantity demanded. Therefore, in this case with our price ceiling, we have a shortage. This is called a shortage. So with this price ceiling, seeing this shortage, we know that this is going to lead to more deadweight loss in our market. There are gains from trade not being realized when we're selling at this price of $5. We have a shortage in the market. We have consumers that would have paid that $10, and consumers and producers alike would have been happier at that price of $10. Even though consumers are happy with that $5. Like I said, these extra consumers come into the market because that price is lowered. All right. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. And okay, so we looked at this price ceiling. To talk a little bit more about the price ceiling, once again, we're setting that maximum allowed price. So instances where we might see this is maybe some kind of natural disaster where there's a law you cannot charge over this price for electric or this price for drinking water or ice. What we call that is price gouging. So when consumers are in a really vulnerable state, when they would pay up to this given amount, but government, some institution steps in and they decide that this is quote unquote unfair. So this is why we kind of talk about that unfair. So price gouging seems unfair in the situation or in the circumstance of a natural disaster. So someone steps in, they set this price ceiling, and the immediate consequence is going to be, even though this price ceiling was set in order to make prices more fair, that immediate consequence of the price ceiling is going to be a shortage still, okay? So summing it up, well, everything we just talked about, a price floor is going to be a minimum legal price, and this is going to cause surplus. So for a price floor to be effective, this is a minimum price. It needs to be set above equilibrium price, because if it's set below equilibrium price and this is a minimum legal price, that market price is still going to win. It's still going to be allowed. Nothing is restricting it. Nothing is binding that price control. So that is why we know we need price floors to be set above equilibrium price and this price ceiling to be set below our equilibrium price. So this price ceiling is going to be a maximum legal price, okay? And this is going to cause shortage. So if you understand these 4 bullet points right here, then you are set on chapter 24. If you could talk me through these, you are good to go. So moving on to chapter 25 a little bit. With these price controls, we talked about that there are gains from trade that are not being realized when we set these price controls. In setting these price controls, we're distorting the market. We're distorting this price signal that originally was keeping us in equilibrium within the market. It was keeping supply and demand in check. So we saw that our quantity supplied and our quantity demand changes when we set a price control. And that is what leads to our deadweight loss. All right. So the question from then is, how do we graph that deadweight loss and who is going to take on that deadweight loss? So once again, let's go to our graph to draw this out. All right. So showing deadweight loss. All right, so looking at the deadweight loss from 1, a ceiling, and 2, a floor. First, in the ceiling, we see that our deadweight loss, or we see in this first graph that our ceiling leads to excess demand. We have a demand that's higher than our supply. So now in this case, where we have a price floor, we have a supply that's higher than demand. So this leads to, a floor leads to this excess supply, and a ceiling leads to excess demand, okay? So this is what is contributing to that deadweight loss. So the next step in finding that deadweight loss, we're going to calculate the producer surplus and the consumer surplus in the ceiling. So at this price floor, or at this price ceiling, our producer surplus is going to be found right here, from that supply curve up to our price control, up to that market price that we're selling at. So that is showing us right here in the yellow. This is showing us that producer surplus. Our consumer surplus now is going to be a little bit different. So in this case now, to find our consumer surplus, we're going to go from this market price and we're going to go all the way up to the demand line. So in this case, we go up to the demand curve where that price is, where that market price is going to be. And now in this case, actually, let's make it a different color. Let's make it pink. In this case, now we have our consumer surplus cut a little bit smaller. So in this case now, our price is right here. Our equilibrium price being sold is right here. We're going to go up to that demand curve and find that consumer surplus in here. So this now leaves us with this deadweight loss right here in the middle. So because we are now setting this price control, this binding price ceiling, at this price of whatever, this lower price, when we sell at this price in the market, rather than this equilibrium price up here, what's going to happen is this deadweight loss in the middle. So this is our deadweight loss. So once again, in order to find that producer and consumer surplus, we need to go to where the market price is, go up to the demand curve to find it, and then down to find the supplier surplus. Okay. And so in this case of a price ceiling, what's happening is that this consumer surplus is being cut back. We are seeing that consumers in this case are feeling the burden of that price ceiling. So that deadweight loss is being placed on consumers in this example, okay? So let's do the same thing with our price floor. So now in drawing this price floor, to find the deadweight loss, first what we're going to do is find producer and consumer surplus. So we're going to do that over here. So in order to find consumer surplus, once again, we're going to go up to the demand curve down to that market price. So our consumer surplus here is going to be from the top of this demand curve down to our market price. So now in order to find our consumer surplus, what we're going to do is take that market price and drag it down to that supply curve, okay? So now we know that all above this supply and up to this market price is where we see that consumer surplus. So now because of this price control, this binding price control is cutting off our producer surplus down here. We see that we now have a little bit of a triangle still left over of this deadweight loss in the middle. So because we're not producing and we're not selling at that equilibrium price, that free floating price that would be the market price otherwise without that price control, we now have a deadweight loss right here. So we can calculate the amount of deadweight loss from setting that price control. So one, the size of our triangle is going to tell us how large that deadweight loss also is. So we can look at it and say, okay, that's a pretty large deadweight loss. And once again, we can calculate whether it's being felt by the consumers on the top, because we always know the consumer surplus is going to be up here. We know this is our consumer surplus and this is our producer surplus. So in calculating that deadweight loss, we can see whether the consumers are going to feel the burden of that price control or whether the producers are going to feel the burden of that price control. All right, so let's go back to our PowerPoint and just finish up this deadweight loss. So one last thing with deadweight loss is when we set these price controls, we might not be allocating these goods as well as we could. So let's go back to the example from the book, ice in the case of a natural disaster. So when we have some kind of scarcity on ice, during a natural disaster, what we would expect to see is the price of ice skyrocket. So with the price of that ice skyrocketing, if I were a consumer that really needs that ice, so I need that ice once again, if I was a diabetic and I needed to keep my insulin cold, I would need that ice. I would value that ice. I would be willing to pay maybe a lot more than someone else might be, but maybe say I'm restricted by inability to pay because of that price gouge. So in this case, we are not allocating our resources as efficiently as we should. So meaning that when we set these price controls, our highest value consumers may not be getting these products, and these higher value producers may not be the ones able to sell these products. Because once again, these price controls are going to cut out either consumers or producers from the market. So when we sum that up, we know that consumers who take on deadweight loss, that realistically in a random market, in actual real world economics, we know that these consumers that in the case of a natural disaster, And for people who need ice, it's not always going to be the diabetics that don't get that ice. It's going to be a distribution of different consumers with different willingness to pay. So it's not always just those the lower high value consumers that are going to be taken away from, but this does stress the point that when we have dead weight loss, it could even be a larger dead weight loss than we realize from that graph. We could be taking away more value from consumers than we even thought. If consumers are valuing a certain resource or good at a really high value, and then we come in and set this price control, it's going to distort the market. It's going to throw us out of equilibrium. It's going to make the market, it's going to make producers and consumers kind of go out of whack. They're out of whack. They shift and they're out of place. So to show one last example of how we kind of show which consumers are the most important consumers losing from this dead weight loss, I will show this example on a graph. So let's draw, once again, let's just do that market for ice. We just have our supply, demand. Okay, so in this case, our demand curve shows all the different willingness to pays. So our price is on this y-axis. We see that at this high price, this many people are willing to pay. We go down here to find the quantity. And at this price, this many people are willing to pay. We go down here to find the quantity. So now when originally we would have our equilibrium right here in our market. But if we're setting some kind of price ceiling in this ice market, I'm going to do it in purple. We're going to come down here, set our price here. And once again, we're out of whack here. Consumers and producers are out of whack. All right. Because we see that our quantity supplied is going to be a lot less than our quantity demanded. So in this case, because we have a lower price for this ice, because we're mandating a lower price for ice, we have this many more consumers that come into the market. So in this case, let's say that all of our individuals here, these individuals up here are the ones that really value this ice, that this ice is life-saving for them. They would pay up to this price. But now when we set this price control, this price ceiling, we come into the market and say, okay, like this isn't fair. This high price isn't fair. Let's bring the price down. This is going to cause even more problems because now we see that when we bring that price down, we have a shortage. We have more people demanding the good than number of goods available. So in this case, at this low price, people are coming into the market to buy ice to chill their beer. The example used in the book, the ice is being used at this lower cost to chill their beer, to chill consumers' beer. Whereas these consumers up here that were receiving the good before, but are not guaranteed the good now that we have this shortage down here, because we have that shortage, we cannot assure that our ice is going to the people who really need it the most. Okay. I hope that clears things up a little bit more. For chapters 24 and 25, please send questions into the Discord if there are any more questions, any more confusion on these two chapters. All right. Thank you for watching.